Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. In this episode, we feature Mikia Castillo, co-founder of Castillo Consulting Partners. Mikia has over 2 decades of experience in leadership development, strategic planning, design thinking, grassroots community organizing, youth engagement, policy advocacy, and systems change. A commitment to social justice and racial equity permeates each aspect of her personal and professional life. Mikia supports organizations with developing, implementing, and assessing data-driven strategies, and she designs and facilitates leadership development trainings, conducts equity assessments, and moderates important conversations around race, bias, and equity. Her expertise lies in helping companies effectively embed equity, inclusion, diversity, access, and anti-racism into their leadership, policies, and procedures so they can best support and retain their people. Mikia is an Afro-Latina who was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles. She's a first-generation alumna who has committed her life and career to developing leaders, investing in communities, and promoting equity. She holds bachelor's degrees in ethnic studies and urban studies and planning from UCSD, and dual master's degrees in public policy and urban planning. She's an adjunct faculty member at USC and also teaches Black, Latino, and Latin American relations courses in the Pan-African Studies Department at Cal State Los Angeles. Mikia graciously shares her expertise in this episode. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy as much as we did. Hi, I'm Jessa.
And I'm Laurel, and today's guest is Mikia. We're so happy to have you. This has been much anticipated. Thank you for joining us. And we'll start as we always do. We know that you're not an environmental professional, but how are you connected to AEP?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been excited to have this conversation as well. And yes, how am I connected to AEP? Well, I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and anti-racism professional, and got connected to AEP a few months ago when AEP's executive leadership and board decided to expand the work that they're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're looking for a consultant who could help take you all on your journey to the next phase of this work in the DEI space. And so I was recommended by a couple of organizations that I work with in the environmental space. And it just, things have boomed from there. We got started pretty quickly, and here I am.
Tell us more about that environmental space.
Yeah, great question. So there are several organizations that I have an opportunity to work with around diversity, equity, inclusion that are in the do environmentalism work or conservation work. Some of those include Grid Alternatives. They're based in San Diego, but a national organization I don't know if they're actually based in San Diego, but I'm working with some folks who are based in San Diego, and they're a national organization that does solar installation. So they're one of our current partners we work with. We also have worked with Rails to Trails, who a lot of folks are familiar with, also a national organization. And we've done some DEI training with them. We've worked with SCA, the Student Conservation Association, and have supported them in their diversity, equity, inclusion work. My background is in urban planning and public policy. And so I've had an opportunity to work with APA and also with PlaceWorks, who I know was one of the big partners with AEP and more focused on the planning side, but also does environmentalism work. And Surfrider Foundation is another one. So, the list just goes on and on. I know I'm missing some folks, so apologies if y'all are AEP members and I haven't mentioned you. I will try to remember to mention you throughout this podcast interview. But the work that I do or my organization does, is to support organizations with developing leaders that are driving systemic change. That's our tagline. And we know that environmentalism, and especially addressing issues of environmental racism, is kind of the nexus between diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmentalism. And so we try to support organizations in their efforts to address environmental issues at the intersection of race, justice, economic justice, so on and so forth.
That's great. And I was like giggling almost. I was like, is that it? Because it's everybody, which is wonderful. And I think, that last point about, how important the environmental issues are to the issues that you as a professional deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's systemic. It's all interconnected. And I was getting ready to ask you, what attracted you to a career in DEI? And then I realized that you are saying like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, kind of a two-part is like, the intent to not just shorten it to DEI and be more intentional about using the words as we talk about it?
Yeah, Jessica, that's a great question. A few thoughts there. I guess answering the first part of the question.
Sorry, it's like a two-parter.
I love that. I do the same thing. I ask, 15 questions in one, because when you're intrigued by whatever somebody has to say, everything comes out. And especially when you have somebody like me who talks a lot. So at least that's what my mom says. So how I got into this work is really just through my personal background and experiences. I was born and raised in South LA, South Central specifically, which got renamed South LA, and grew up in Inglewood and South Central and the South Bay here in Los Angeles. And I, as a child, developed asthma at a young age. I think I was in elementary school. I wasn't born with asthma. If you hear the noise in the background, that's my 7-month-old. I'm a mom. I didn't like say more about myself outside of my, professional, my resume, but you'll hear him in the background. He just has to be close to mom, even as I'm in this podcast. But yeah, so
we get a special featured guest. It's okay.
Featured guest, 7-month-old Legacy. And at some point, 2-year-old Justice might wake up too. So I developed asthma at a young age, as I mentioned, and what we were told as a kid, there were assumptions about why. When we went to the doctor, it was all based on my individual experience, right? And decisions, personal decisions that were being made, like, oh, well, somebody in the household must be smoking. Nobody in our household smoked at all. Well, then it must be tied to genetics. Asthma is not tied to, there's like no evidence that asthma is connected to genetics. As far as I know, even today, like more research is showing that that's not the case at all. But what we did learn, or especially what I learned as an adult, is that it is tied to environmental factors, right? That's not anything that any physician ever told us when I was growing up, that there could be something happening outside of my home, outside of our home, in the environment around us that was impacting our health. And that I, as a child, developed asthma as a result of those environmental injustices in my community, right? And so I didn't know that and understand that as a child. I just knew that I had severe asthma that felt like it came out of nowhere, where I was hospitalized regularly, having to take steroid inhalers 6 to 12 times a day, every 4 to 6 hours. As a kid, I had what's called a nebulizer. If anybody's familiar, people are more familiar with them because unfortunately during COVID, folks have had to use nebulizers to stabilize themselves if they've had any kind of, like if they've had COVID in extreme cases. And so I was on nebulizers. I had to go to the hospital, the ER, on a regular basis, and I had steroid shots to stabilize my breathing. Come to find out, I wasn't the only person in my community or only child in my community who was experiencing this. Many of my friends had asthma. The nurse's office when I was a kid was filled with kids who had to come in because you couldn't keep your inhaler with you on your person. You had to go into the nurse's office to take your medicine. And it was just like, clockwork, where kids were going in, and I was one of those kids. So why are all of these children in this particular community experiencing severe asthma? And many of us were not born with it. But again, I didn't understand that until I was an adult. An adult, meaning I went to college, right? So as much of an adult as you could be at 18 years old.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I went to UC San Diego. I moved away from LA, first person in my family, first generation college student, went to UC San Diego and discovered urban planning, discovered ethnic studies, discovered, public health courses and environmental justice and environmental courses as a student, and started to connect the dots. And I realized, I've been told my whole life that it was family decisions. It didn't make sense because nobody, was doing the things that we were told. And it turns out that the reason, right, why all of these kids in my community were suffering from asthma is really because of environmental injustices, inequities, where living in South Central LA, you got all these freeways, you have all of these oil rigs, right? And so the air quality is really poor. And you have old homes that have all kinds of chemicals and things in there that we don't know about, that the soil is not good, right? Like there are all of these different types of issues that my community, I think, somewhat knows that those at the time knew that they were there, but didn't necessarily connect them as systemic. So that's how I got involved in this work, because when I went to school, to college, and started learning about these issues and then saw how they paralleled my experience in my life, it became very clear to me that something needed to change, right? And that's why I decided that I wanted to pursue a career in urban planning and ethnic studies. I was just so mesmerized by, oh my gosh, there's like a bigger story about my life that I had no idea.
I hear you. And before you answer just a second question, wanted to share that I had a similar experience, not that I had asthma, but going to university, and you have this like epiphany and this realization of the interconnectedness of all the things that you witnessed as a child. And then you start to learn environmental studies, urban planning, and you're like, oh, these are like systemic things that are interconnected. And if I can have a career or a profession in this, wow, what change I could make. I had that realization. And then one of my first jobs was working at the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, and staying in San Pedro, and just being in that community and witnessing and experiencing the air quality issues that come from, as you said, the infrastructure, the roads, as well as, boats and cargo. And they're doing incredible things to clean this up. But LA, the way it's situated as an air basin, holds all those things in, and the sun bakes it, for lack of a better word. And then that's what you're breathing in, is like baked bad stuff.
Well, I feel like as a kid, like I grew up in rural Missouri, so I had a very, very different experience. But, seeing the news, and I'm thinking probably like, the 90s, it's like LA was smog. Like that's like what I thought about LA. I can like picture it in like movies and stuff. And like, it's just this big city covered in this cloud of smog.
It's true. I mean, and we were living that, and some folks were being impacted by it more than others, right? And Laurel talked about San Pedro and Long Beach. At one point, I don't know what the numbers are now, but at least 15, 20 years ago, when I was looking into this, and especially with the focus on the ports, not as an environmental professional, but as a community organizer who was organizing communities to say, our children and our families deserve better than this terrible air quality. And we want to support goods and services being transported across the country, right? We have the largest port, like most of the goods that come into the country come through Long Beach and San Pedro, and they get shipped across the 710 freeway and so on and so forth. But when our children's lung capacity is at 70% of what it should be, and we compare that to the rest of the, LA County and other parts of the state, that's not okay. So interestingly enough, right, again, not an environmental professional, but going and organizing a community like, hey, these are my people. And I was one of those children. And it took me going to San Diego to learn, like, okay, this is not normal, and it shouldn't be normalized at all. It's not okay that this is happening. You didn't deserve that as a child. No other children deserve that. Nobody does. So how do we fix it? That's really kind of what got me into the environmental work. And in addition to like all the other economic justice and, justice issues that I focus on in my work and in my career. But to the question around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we do work that's diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and anti-racism. And I always name it because people do know DEI. They've heard of DEI. And they lump them all together. Not everybody focuses on justice and anti-racism. I know in a lot of environmentalism organizations, there's a focus on justice because folks use JEDI. That's like the term that gets used around in a lot of different environmental conservation spaces. But the anti-racism piece is really critical for our work, because what we know is that these systemic issues that we've been talking about so far impact everybody, but they definitely have a concerted impact, or like the impact is even greater in low-income communities and communities of color, because a lot of low-income communities happen to be communities of color, not by chance, but by systemic, like because of systems that were put in place to create those communities. And so we want to make sure that in our work, we are looking at, yes, let's help organizations increase diversity. But just because you have a beautiful rainbow of people and folks from the LGBTQ community and folks who are with, living with a disability and mothers and parents and all, just because you have all that does not mean that there's equity in the organization. And just because if you work toward equity doesn't mean everybody's feeling included. And just because you have inclusion doesn't mean that you're actually addressing issues of injustice. And when you have all those things together, it does not mean that you're actually addressing racism. And so we have to look at them individually as well as collectively. And so we say them out loud to remind people that they are all uniquely important, and collectively you have to work on them individually and have them all working at the same time simultaneously in order to actually get to the systemic change that we want.
I thank you for walking us through that. It is important to know what we're talking about. And it was reminding me of these feelings and experiences I had as an environmental professional, and I was learning about abundance and diversity of organisms as a key indicator or metric of a healthy ecosystem, where all the animals are organisms. There's a lot of them, and they're diverse, and they're all doing their thing really well. Like the mushrooms, the mycelial network, all community, degrading things, creating food, feeding the trees, like it's all functioning together. And that was I felt in my heart, isn't that how humans should be living? And I know it sounded at the time, to everyone I was talking to, it was super hippy dippy harmony, like let's go, hug some trees kind of thing. But it makes economic, social justice sense. It makes sense for us as human beings to behave in a healthy ecosystem way. So I can see the tie, not just from like an experience being sick in your habitat, and learning about urban planning and how to do that. But what is the vision, in your opinion? So that was my environmental professional opinion. In your opinion, in your professional opinion, what is the vision for a healthy society?
Laurel, that was a tree hugger hippy dippy, but I like it. I'm vegan, right? So I'm definitely like fully vegan, tree hugger, hippy dippy, commitment mom, as they say. I learned all these terms since I became a mom a couple of years ago. But I like that example. And what I want to just build on that and say, and when one of those, when you have this biodiversity, but one animal or one part of that biodiversity is excluded or eliminated, like we were talking about is extinction and, things like that before we started this conversation on the podcast, when you remove one of those, it throws everything off kilter, right? If we don't know, like we don't fully understand the ramifications of animals that have been removed from this earth because of the environmental degradation that we have caused as humans on this earth, right? For the ones that have been extinct, like for a long time. And we were talking about monarch butterflies and how they've been put on the list of animals that could potentially, or I guess they're not really an animal, but you know what I mean? Y'all know, all the folks who are the sciencey people know what I'm talking about, right? And that's a concern. And we don't know. I mean, bees, right? Like I'm so careful with bees. We go to a local community garden with our kids, and my son is like swatting at the bees. I'm like, don't hurt the bees. And that's like a big thing that kids have been learning. Why? Because we know that if we remove them from our world, that there will be, far-reaching impacts. And I will say that I think the same thing is true in the work that we do in our lives as human beings, that if you're missing out on so much that a whole group of people have to offer if they're not included in the workplace, right? I mean, just imagine, I'm a woman. I see here we have she, her gender pronouns on the screen, indicating that the three of us on this call, I believe, identify as women. Think about the how much was missing from workforces for all of these years when women were excluded from the workforce, right? You didn't have this amazing thinking. We can literally see there's data that shows the changes that have occurred when women began to have, well, not just began, when women, like when we pushed our ways into taking opportunities in leadership and saying we should have a stake at the table and we're going to take it and we can lead and it's going to be great. And then you look at look at organizations that are led by women and how different people feel in those organizations, right? And how well these women are leading. But imagine all of that was missing before women were given a seat at the table and an opportunity to lead, right? And we have laws that were passed in California just literally in the past 5 years, less than 5 years, that said, we still haven't done enough to make sure that women are fully included. You got to have women on your boards, right? So we literally have a law that says you have to have women on your boards because people were not including women on their boards. And then you see the shift in how these organizations are operating. So when you're missing gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, diversity of folks with different lived experiences, people from different economic backgrounds, and just all the different types of diversity, you are missing out. Like, there's so much potential being left on the table, and you're not optimizing how your company can operate. You're not optimizing the brilliance, like, you don't have the brilliance of ideas that could be flowing that would actually improve the world around us.
I agree. I mean, you're missing the social value, which has value in the business. And when I was just talking about this with a very close family member about how when she was a stay-at-home mom, she had no value in the economic system, even though it's a full-time job. It's like non-paid slave labor, basically, not slave labor. Of course, that was a very strong word, but it's non-paid labor to take care of the future of our civilization. And when we enter the workforce, we don't have the support that we need to share the highest and best value of our social equity with the organization, when we don't have the resources at our disposal. But indeed, our organizations, our businesses, our agencies thrive when that type of organism is added into the ecosystem, for sure. And so how did you get into this business yourself? Because you have an incredible background. Obviously, AEP wanted to engage you yesterday, like immediately. We talked about your academic background. How did you get into this consulting world, doing the beautiful work you do?
Thanks. Yeah. So I mentioned that in my education, I think I mentioned that when I went to school, I learned about urban planning, environmental issues, health, and all the intersections. And I also learned about ethnic studies. And ethnic studies, I felt like, was home for me because it was a place where I felt seen and heard by everybody who was in that space. I'm going to be honest and say that going to UC San Diego was a challenge. When I was a student there, Black students were 1% of the population. Actually, we were less than 1%. We used to have shirts that said represent and then the less than sign 1%. Because out of the 20,000 undergrads, we literally knew that there were 156 Black students across the undergraduate population, right? This is in the state of California, in San Diego, California. My family's from Central America, from Panama, and the Latino student population was 2% in San Diego when I was a student there. I mean, it was just incredibly unbelievable. And so being a minority of minorities at UC San Diego, and coming from the community I grew up in, right? A community where it was mostly students of color, Black, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander. We had Samoan and Tongan. Like, we just had this very Filipino, like a very diverse array of students, with the exception of white students. We had it was like the complete opposite experience. We had a handful of white students in my schools growing up. And then we had pretty much very few people of color when I went to college. And that is when I started to realize how my experience growing up was so different than some of my classmates who didn't, have, for example, free lunch. I received free lunch my whole life. Pretty much none of my classmates they didn't receive free lunch. That was something that was looked down on, right? Because of, whatever their upbringings were. And so it was an interesting experience and dynamic for me. And I had a desire as a person who was feeling very excluded to learn how to create inclusive places, make every place inclusive for every person so that they didn't feel like I don't belong here. And I learned that pretty much like right out the gate when I got to UC San Diego. And I did love my time there. I learned so much. I was able to, make a lot of friends and build a strong community around me. But it was in that experience that I realized I want to be able to do something. And at the time, I didn't know what diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DI consulting was. I don't actually, it was a profession, but it was like very minimally so. There were people who were doing work in this space, but it wasn't to the extent that it is now. So I didn't even know that this was a career path that I could pursue. But I knew that I wanted to do something like that, right? How do I make sure that students in classrooms who may be one of few, first of all, should not be one of few, right? We should have this beautiful, especially in California. Come on, right? Like, we're one of the most diverse, most populous states in the country. Why is it that we still have classes and schools and workplaces that don't reflect that diversity? And so that's what I wanted to be able to do, is to help reflect that diversity. And then also to address these inequities. I mean, as a student, I worked multiple jobs. I worked at In-N-Out Burger. I'm vegan, by the way. I think I said that already, but I was a vegan when I was growing up. And so my first job in high school was at In-N-Out Burger. And I worked at the one in Pacific Beach, for anybody who's in San Diego.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, I frequented.
Right. And so I frequented too. And luckily I got free meals as an employee, but I worked at In-N-Out Burger. I drove buses on campus at UC San Diego. I also drove buses around the campus through the city bus, because that was the highest paying job that I could find as an undergraduate student. Right. I did whatever I could to try to supplement my financial aid, because I didn't have financial support from my family. People couldn't afford it. I was a first generation college student, the first person to ever move away. And I just didn't want that experience for other folks. And so that's how I decided that I really wanted to address these inequities, both at an individual level with people, and then how do we address them systemically? And that's how I got into this work.
I'm just also saying to all the business world, isn't that the kind of worker that you want? The one who knows her worth ethic, the one that's got a good work ethic, the one that goes out there and chases and hustles and gets it done. Like, aren't those the people that we should be hiring? And as I'm thinking about this and feeling this, that's how AEP feels, is that there's this untapped resource of people who would thrive as environmental professionals and contribute significant value to our industry if we were able to bring them into the profession. And we're just not. Like our organization, I'm sure you could touch on this probably doing our survey and analyzing our industry. The AEP board analyzed the industry and realized that we do not represent the populace of California. And there's something like 12,000 environmental professionals in the workforce that we don't capture. There are middle school and high school students who do not understand the interconnectedness of the environmental world and the lives they live, like you didn't realize until you went to UCSD. How do we make them more aware earlier? And that was the reason behind engaging you, is because we just felt this. Well, during the pandemic, we wanted to offer free student memberships for our organization, because we want to bring those students into our organization and usher them into the profession and keep them growing with us and changing laws, policy, work that we do, adding value to our organization. So that was the first step that we took. And then we did a deep dive analysis into the makeup of our industry and realized, holy moly, massive group of people that we are not including. And are we not including them? Do we have barriers? Like, we're just not aware. And so hiring you was to be like, what do we not know? And how do our members feel about that? And what can we do? What are very specific right actions that we can take as an organization to get people that we need involved in our organization? And that's why we brought you on board. So could you please explain a little bit about the scope of the effort that you're working on and when the world could expect the results of our analysis?
Well, I will do my best. But yeah, Laura, every time you ask a question, I start all these things start going off in my head.
You share what you want to share, Mikia. Right. This is your time.
A couple thoughts that came to mind. I'm going to answer your question. One is we're actually doing some work with AQMD right now, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and specifically around AB 617. So if folks are familiar with AB 617, state legislation, of course, that is looking at air quality and how do we reduce emissions in certain communities. And AQMD here in Southern California has a unique model that they are, I don't want to say they're piloting it, but it is the only place where they're doing this right now, which is that they have a co-lead relationship with organizations in South LA and the AQMD, so small nonprofit organizations that are doing environmental justice work specifically with AQMD. They're partnered together to lead the South LA community through creating their community emissions reduction plan, right? So their SERP. And it's been incredible and fascinating, and I feel like so empowering to see. Of course, there are challenges, right? But it's to your point, Laurel, what are we missing, right? AQMD realized we need to be partnering more with community organizations and have like to shift the balance of power, if you will, and try to have like a co-leadership model that is actually having community members who've been doing this work from their vantage point in the community as advocates to actually help shape the direction of this emissions reductions plan. And I think it's been great, and there are lots of learnings, and it just points to a potential model that I think other organizations can follow in this space. More on that to come too, because we're in the process to implement. I just had a meeting, I think 2 days ago, and we're about to start implementation of that SERP. It was approved last month, and CARB, it's going to CARB on August 25th for their approval. And then boom, in September, we're hoping that we're going to be ready to go and implement into the implementation phases of the work. But I just wanted to give that as an example of like a potential model that other organizations may look to.
And I want to pop in and give a shout out to AEP, because we do that in that model in an interesting way, where we do a public partnership. AEP is highly involved in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research when it comes to CEQA and policy, and we're holding hands with those folks at the agency, training legislators as they come in on CEQA and environmental law that they're going to propose, like ABs and SBs that come out. How does that affect how environmental laws are implemented and how CEQA analyzes impacts and stuff? So we fully support that model and think it would be great for all agencies to do what AQMD is doing, because then you're bringing in this knowledge and this resource that you don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think along those lines, what you mentioned earlier about what the executive board decided for AEP is we don't know what we don't know. Who can we bring in that's going to help us figure out what we don't know, so then we can change things and increase not just diversity, but really focus on equity and inclusion. And I think hopefully justice and anti-racism also will be a part of the conversation. But yes, we did launch a survey a couple months ago. And our Castillo consulting partners did work in partnership with the executive board. And specifically, there's a DEI, a Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee on the executive board that is doing some incredible work. They had already been doing some thinking around this, but like you said, launched in 2020 after George Floyd's murder, and said, what can we do in our space, right, within our locus of control to address these diversity, equity, inclusion challenges in our profession. And they've been putting their heads together. They're meeting regularly to have conversations about ideas that they're getting from members, as well as what they're coming up with themselves. I don't think that I'm not in the space yet to be able to share what those things are, because I have no idea what's going to come of this just yet. But the data collection process has gone really well. Thank you to everybody who has submitted a survey response. We started analyzing that data, and we're finding some interesting trends that are coming up, because not only were we collecting demographic information, because AEP has not done that historically, and that was one of the first recommendations we had. It's so critical, not just AEP, but every organization we work with. I think people shy away from wanting to collect demographic information because we think, we should be colorblind and we shouldn't have this information. But there's a reason why we need that information. We need that information to be able to see whether or not there are inequities, or just to even know, does our population mirror the state's population, or are we reflective of the communities we serve, right? Because some of our organizations work in communities that don't reflect the diversity of the state, but they may be a predominantly Black or Latino or Asian Pacific Islander community, a predominantly LGBTQ community. So there's a concentration of people, and our organizations should really, I think, reflect those populations and make sure that we're actively and intentionally seeking to hire folks from those communities, because we're working to serve those communities. So who better to help you come up with innovative ideas about how to best serve a community than the people from that community, right? And I think that that's what AEP is committed to, figuring out what to do and how to do that through this process.
Exactly. We were sitting in a board meeting and we were looking around the table and we're like, are we reflective of our industry? I don't think so. I get the feeling that we're probably not. And yet we're on this board making decisions for things that affect, I think everyone in California and beyond, because environmental matters are your habitat. But yeah, we all sat at the table and we looked around and we're like, we have to make a change.
Well, I have 500 questions. I'll try to keep it to maybe 5. But, as you're talking about this, same thing. My brain is like going like crazy. And I'm thinking like with my employer hat on and the man hat. But, there's a few things here. And one is that, when we talk about diversity and the intent to look for employees, like I think of this and like collecting, sorry, I'm like going all over the place, but collecting demographic information. There's so many like HR laws and people are so afraid to like touch it. And so it's like, how as an employer do you recruit for diversity without, you know what I mean? I've seen some job ads maybe, and I might answer my own question where it's like, we're inclusive, but they're just words, you really have to show that you're inclusive and that there is like, the equity and justice, anti-racism, all these other like systemic factors to have that type of environment. And so how as an employer, can you actively create a diverse workforce?
Jessica, that's a great question. And it's so multifaceted that I hope I can answer it in the amount of time that we have. No, it's okay. Because it's a question we get all the time, right? How can you do that? There are HR laws, so on and so forth. And it's true, there are HR laws, but it doesn't prohibit you from what we like to say, right? Making sure that you're fishing in the right pools and ponds for the diverse array of candidates to even be considered for a position, right? So that's not even really the starting point. I'll say this for AEP. We are talking about students. How are we recruiting students? When I was an undergraduate student, I received a free membership to APA. It was like an automatic. I'm a major in urban planning program, so I get APA. And then I went to USC, Fight on Trojans, and I had to give my shout out to USC. And I was in urban planning. I had dual degrees. I was in a dual degree program for public policy and urban planning. And I received a free APA membership as well as at that point. That's how I got introduced to APA at the time, right? If I had gotten introduced to AEP, I may have been an AEP, like lifelonger member of AEP as well. I don't know, right? But I say that to say this. A lot of students, starting younger, Laurel mentioned middle and high school students, they care about environmental issues. My niece, who designed my bookcase as a beautiful rainbow, for those who are watching on YouTube or wherever you get the podcast on video, she was 5 years old and said that she wanted to design this bookcase. She is 8 years old. She is the most recyclist I've ever met in my life, right? She cares so much about the environment. Whenever we walk, like going on a walk, there's trash somewhere, she's picking it up. She is young. She's not making all the connections to the systemic issues, but she is committed to being an environmentalist, right? She's learned it at an early age. However, because we have her in the schools that we have her in, right, that's making a difference. When I was a kid, those are like, nobody helped me connect those dots. So I didn't know what the opportunities were. I didn't know what the possibilities were. So if we're starting with STEM education and AEP has, y'all are the boots on the ground, right? You are the environmental professionals. If we can make those connections, like we have these really smart people who understand environmentalism. We have these really brilliant kids who are so committed to making sure that the earth is healthy and that they're cleaning up and they want to do their beach cleanup days, right? How many beach cleanup days did we all do in high school? How many of us got into, AEP or like got into environmental professional because of stuff like that, right? So I think that's one of the things that helps with recruitment. The other piece is, and I was talking to some of the executive board members about this, is when we talk about equity, education is one piece of equity. There's also the incarceration system, right? All these systems are interconnected. Some of us have heard about how currently incarcerated people, many of them, when we have these massive forest fires, like what we're seeing right now in our state in Yosemite, that we don't have enough firefighters to do that work, right? So the state of California has tapped into incarcerated to the prison system and having incarcerated individuals go and learn how to put out forest fires, which we all know, right? Or maybe we don't all know, but we know that it takes skill. It takes an understanding of the environment, understanding the safety measures that are required. What's happening with the trees when they're, catching on fire, all these kind of things that I don't understand, but there are fire things that are related to environmentalism. And I know that those are folks who, when they get out of prison, guess what? they're not allowed to become firefighters. There are advocates who are pushing and pushing. I'm one of those, right? Pushing and pushing to say, why is it that we can have them making $1 a day fighting fires to protect our environment and our state and protect homes of folks who are being evacuated. And then when they come out of prison, they're not allowed to get a job as a firefighter. How can we tap into that it's not even untapped, because it was tapped. This is a very tapped population of people. And then when they're free again, we're not utilizing those skills. We're just like leaving all of that potential on the table. And it's an injustice, right? It's a total injustice. Imagine how many of those individuals would be eligible to work in the environmental professions. Those are the types of, I think, innovative ways that we need to be thinking about recruiting and removing barriers, right? And so when we say, how do we ask those types of questions on a application, doing things like that, the words are just words until you're serious about them, right? And you can say, we welcome individuals who were formerly incarcerated if they're interested in positions here, because we know that these are great jobs that don't necessarily require a degree if you don't have it. And we want to address this inequity, the systemic inequity. We welcome folks who don't have a college degree for these positions. We are looking to increase diversity, not for diversity's sake, but because we know that there's value that you bring from your background to this space, because your communities are impacted too, to Laurel's point, right? Everybody's impacted by environmental issues. So I know that was a long-winded response. But
it's so good. It's so good. And I wanted to touch on that is because recruiting means you need to target the pool or new pool of people. And we don't know this yet. And we don't know this yet, but is AEP as an organization intimidating to those who don't have four-year university degrees? Is it intimidating to those who don't have community college degrees? Is it intimidating to high schoolers and middle schoolers because it's, quote unquote, professional? Like, are we just by our natural business as usual precluding people from joining us simply because they don't have degrees? But there's so much work in this industry where you don't need accelerated or higher levels of education to be a significant contributor to the impact analyses that we do, to the remediation and restoration work that we do, the construction. I mean, this organization isn't just conserving lands and restoring lands, but we construct things, and we construct buildings and infrastructure and renewable energy power plants and energy storage systems and all this infrastructure that we need these very skilled people who live in the community to work in that community. It's been annoying and heartbreaking for me to see me recruiting, like when I work on a big industrial project, recruiting people from outside the community that I'm building this project in, because the community that I'm building this project in isn't connected to this industry. And I'm like, why? They should have these jobs. This could be intergenerational wealth for them.
It's true, Laurel, and it's happening in so many spaces. And I will say that I think this is, again, the conversation we're having now is the type of conversation that needs to be happening with every HR team and every organization, environmental organization, otherwise. What are we doing to ensure that we are correcting for and addressing inequities that have been built into these systems for a long time, because they are interconnected? The very communities again, everybody's impacted by environmental issues and degradation. However, some communities are impacted more than others. And when we are working in communities where we're seeing that heightened level of or disproportionate impact from environmental issues, like a community like mine, where I started this, my journey in this work, where children are developing asthma at much higher rates because of these policies that allow for it, because of inequities, then we really need to be doing some in-reach in those communities and identifying ways to partner with the community, not in a tokenizing way, right? Just to be able to say, look, we have these few people from the community who are now part of the conversation, but we are resourcing them. We are giving them the resources. We are creating job opportunities, because as you mentioned, there's so many job opportunities in this space that require skills and education, but just not to the same degree as some other roles in the environmental space. And perhaps somebody, I know young people, but like in their 30s, who were incarcerated for much of their, adolescence, and then went off to school, later, like in their 30s, got a bachelor's degree after they were introduced to a job in the environmental profession, right? Like they got introduced to it and one of the, doing some remediation and they're like, wow, this is fascinating. I want to move up the ladder. And so it actually, sure, years later, and they are what we call a non-traditional student. I'm a professor as well, right? So what we call non-traditional student pathways. They're taking non-traditional student pathways, but it was because they were given an opportunity to do some work in their community. And whatever that organization is decided, you know what, doesn't matter that they have a criminal background. That doesn't matter because that is a part of their story. It's not fully and wholly who they are. And they have so much to offer here. And this is their community and they want to be involved. And then now that person is moving up the ladder and moving up the ranks and increasing their educational awareness and not just their awareness, but actually getting degrees to be, in higher levels of this change. And I just want to say this, a lot of the organizations we work with in the environmental space are struggling with and wrestling with, we're environmentalists, we're conservationists. Can we actually focus on environmental justice, right? Can we say that we do environmental justice? And that it's hard for folks to be able to move in that direction. If you don't start to have real conversations around environmental justice and really think about environmental justice as a part of who you are as an organization, you're going to be a dinosaur soon. And I say that because the youth care about environmental justice. I mean, look at what's happening in the world around us, right? Who is leading who's leading the conversation right now? The activists are 15, they're literally 13-year-old kids, right? Who are on not national stages, international stages. And they're talking about environmental justice. They're tying it to racial justice. They're tying it to economic justice. So those of us who are a little bit older than that, I always tell my students, I'm still 21. I've been with my husband for 21 years. So you do the math, but right. Those of us who are 21 and above, we need to get with the times because the young folks are really, really committed to addressing inequities and they don't want to move forward with just like the traditional, we're just the environmental organization. No, environmentalism in and of itself, if you're focused on it, it is an act of justice. You are looking to right the wrongs of environmental inequities in our society. So you got to just name it and move forward with it and figure out how to incorporate it into your work on a regular basis.
I mean, I want those people to have a job doing this. And just, I know you have a question. I'll pause.
Oh yeah, no, I have a lot. Well, I'll try. I know we're getting towards the end of our time here though. So one question I have though, is we're talking about this is what can employers do? Well, I say employers, like leaders, people in the decision-making position, like what can they do literally tomorrow to start to focus on, all of, you got to start somewhere, right? And so like we're talking about this systemic interconnectedness of like diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and anti-racism. And so if someone's listening to this podcast and they're in a decision, I kind of a two-parter, a decision-making position, what can they do? Like, what can they take back and say, okay, today we're going to do this. And the other side of that is if you're an employee of an organization where you're maybe working with some of these dinosaurs, like what's some tools that they can use to bring that conversation to the table?
Yeah, excellent questions. My first thought is most folks in leadership decide we got to do a training. That's what we're going to do. That's the first thing. And there's nothing wrong with training. Training is great. Training is usually not the first place to start. So I just want to say, don't start with training. And the reason for that is because you don't know what you're training for, right? Training could be a really great tool. It is a great tool, right? I'm an educator. So training to me is just an extension of your education beyond your degree or high school or wherever you got your formal education. I would say that leaders need to start with looking at their internal policies, practices, and procedures, right? Let's look at our employee handbook. Let's look at where are we recruiting candidates? Or we have a new position that's opening up. Usually we're trying to fill it quickly, right? Because nobody wants to have a vacancy for so long that everybody else is pulling the weight and, you want to get it filled quickly. But you got to slow down a little bit in order to be able to actually infuse equity, diversity, inclusion, and all of that into your work. So if I'm looking at my recruitment policies and we don't have any, change that right away, right? Recruitment policy says we need to make sure that before we even move to an interview, we need to have a diverse candidate pool. That literally does not preclude anybody from the process. It just means that we're taking the time to add in more folks and not just to say we had yay, we had some diversity in our candidate pool, but to say we really went and sought out folks who would add value to the organization. And we made sure that before we moved into this interview process or our selection process, that we were intentional and thoughtful about creating the space for people who would not otherwise have had an opportunity to really put their hat in the ring for this position. I think that people undervalue that. It is so critical that you're starting with something like that.
Mikia, I have a real world example. The Nature Conservancy released a requisition for a particular role in the organization, and in their list, where it's like degrees and things and experience, it said, if you do not have all these things, but you add other value, we believe in you, please apply, and we will review your application and bring you in, so that people don't look at it and go, well, nope, I'm not doing it. They look at it and go, oh, maybe I could add this.
That's exactly it, right? I mean, words on paper don't mean much until you have the right words on paper that encourage people and they can see themselves as potentially being in your organization, right? So I think that that's critical. If you're not in the process of hiring right now, which I know, unfortunately, we're in going into a recession, so a lot of organizations are at a standstill, not hiring right now. That doesn't mean that you can't look at your internal candidate pool and in your policies, look at how are we making decisions about promotions, right? This is a total inequity issue that we see in a lot of organizations that, if it's addressed, could lead to more diversity in leadership, right? So one example of this is we've worked with we do what we call internal audits. So we audit policies of organizations. And one of the things that we might look at could be performance reviews, right? We want to see what, give us a sample of your performance reviews with just the demographic information, if you have it. And we look at the language. And I can't tell you how many times they're like, the folks just weren't ready for promotion. And then we look at a couple years of performance management reviews, and we find, oh no, there were some biases baked into this, like full-fledged, right? Look at the language between this, how these men are being evaluated versus how these women are being evaluated. For women, people feel intimidated by her, that there's aggressive, she's been aggressive, versus men. He's very assertive and he's demonstrating signs of leadership. Totally unconscious, totally not trying to exclude women from these spaces, but it's happening, right? And we will look at, okay, well, we want to see how who's been promoted over the past 3 years. And then we see trends, very clear trends, because nobody's looking at that data, right? We may see, oh, on average, it took these men were in this position for 6 months before they got promoted. But when we're looking at the women or the BIPOC folks, right, the people of color, they took a year and a half. So there's a whole big gap there that people don't notice because nobody's looking at the data. They're just saying, oh, this individual was ready for the position versus, this is interesting. Why are we seeing that these particular groups are not advancing at the same rate? Is it because they're not qualified, or is it because maybe some bias, or maybe it's a combination of both? But then how do we shore up their skills to get them qualified? So those are some of the things that really take the initiative of a leader to be able to say, have we gone through this with a fine-tooth comb? Right? When we're looking at our team and we're looking at the leadership, like to Laurel's point, right? We look around the room at the executive table and we're like, do we really reflect the populations we serve? And if we don't, why don't we? Then start looking at those types of things internally. And I think that nobody else can do that except HR and leadership within the organization. Other people are doing it, but they don't have the data, right? They're just seeing it's all anecdotal until you actually this is what data-driven decision-making looks like, right? So I would recommend those types of things as some first steps that leaders can take that may feel like a little bit of a lift, but it doesn't, to ask your HR for the data around those things, they could pull that information and say, hey, here's where we are. And then you can start making some changes there. And then you can go to training, right? Then you go to training to say, yes, there is a gap here. Now let's have our staff train to better understand where these biases are coming from and then address those.
That's great. I'm literally taking notes. And now I'm feeling bad because I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm getting like your, free consulting advice right now, like selfishly asking this. Okay. So, we'll have one more question before we get into our wrap up rapid five. Sorry, we're going a little over our scheduled time, but, you're dealing with really intense, heavy issues that are very, on the surface difficult to change. And, you have an infant and a toddler, and you have your own business, and you're a professor, and you're a wife, and you're a human. So how do you take care of yourself? What are some things you do to help you show up and be there for all these things you have going on in the world, and like take care of yourself while you're doing it?
That's a good question, and somewhat a tough question, but I think I can answer it. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because there's so much going on, and I'm transitioning back into work after being on leave for my recent birth. A few things. We have a local community garden that we love to take our kids to, and it gives me an opportunity to just kind of be in nature, if you will, because we can just walk to it. And I love picking strawberries and tomatoes. My 2-year-old loves strawberries. He just like goes and eats them right off the vine, right? And he loves we take our compost. So we've been teaching him composting. He knew composting before he knew the word trash. He knows compost, right? So those are some of the things that I like to do for self-care. It's like, how do I make sure that I'm instilling in the next generation, like they don't even know what this is. What is trash? I don't know, but recycle and compost, right? You know that. So we compost, and he gets to like go and dig up the dirt and like put it in there, like put it into the plants, and then see the fruits of his labor. And so that has given me so much joy. I've also I'm just thinking of like, I have like a lot of things in my head. It's mostly like being out in nature, honestly. And then I'm such an activist. Like I like to be out in the streets and like organizing and advocating and bringing people in, which has been tough to do in this, with the pandemic and everything being virtual. So I've been going to community meetings. This is the nerd in me, but it actually does give me some joy. Going to virtual community meetings and listening in and learning what's happening in the community so that I can still be actively involved, even if I can't show up in person. So if anybody's like me and like, I'm still pretty quarantined as much as you possibly can because of this pandemic, and you want to be more involved, I would say if you can, even listening in the background with the kids, hearing, and my 2-year-old asks all kinds of questions. What are they talking about? Why are they talking about, what is juvenile justice? Like those types of things are what's coming up in our household at age 2. So that brings me joy. I like to believe that, we're raising the next generation of leaders, and we got to start them young, right? Got to start them young. So those are some of the things that I'm doing for self-care these days, which probably don't sound so much like self-care, but I do feel like as a mom, self-care looks a little bit different in a pandemic than it would have if I wasn't in a pandemic. Like, yeah. I would be traveling.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I mean, what an accomplishment that your son knows the word compost over trash. Like, I think that's huge. And I think it's making time for things you care about, and it's not, a spa day or like taking a bath. It's like making time for yourself as like individual and the things that are important to you. So I think that's wonderful. And that's really cool. So I love it. But okay, I was like, oh, this is going to be Laurel. Laurel's like probably taking those notes. All right.
I am taking notes on that because I was like, oh, you're so efficient and effective, and you're like leading, and they're watching, and they're listening, and they're absorbing. I mean, it's monkey see, monkey do. Like when we're kids, we're just like, what are they doing? And then we do that thing. So you're just modeling, and I love it. Thank you for inspiring me. I'm going to be a mom soon, so I'm pumped.
Congrats, Laurel. I had no idea.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, I say I'm going to be a mom soon, but it feels like a very long road ahead of me. But anyway, I will talk to you offline and pick your brain about mother tips. Thank you.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll get up. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We'll get into our wrap up rapid 5. And so just, first thing that pops into your head, and we'll go through these and then we'll close it out. So what is your favorite daily habit?
Walking with my dog and my kids. Great.
What are 3 things you'd bring to a deserted island?
Okay, this one's tough because I'm vegan. And so all the things that I would want are already there. Coconuts, avocados, mangoes, like all of those things are there. So then I would say maybe my husband and my kids and my dog.
I was thinking that. I was like, okay, she has 2 kids, a husband. I was like, I bet it's those and the dog. Yeah. Okay. What is your favorite environmental policy?
Ooh, so I don't know if this counts as a policy, but recently in Manhattan Beach, Bruce's Beach was given back to the family. I don't know if y'all know about Bruce's.
Yeah, I read about this.
So it was it was a beach, Manhattan Beach, part of the beach was owned by a Black family way back when, and it was taken through eminent domain. Clearly, now we recognize that as an inequity or an injustice, but I feel like it's a environmental policy, right? Because I can count it as a policy. LA County Board of Supervisors wrote it into law, right? And so it's environmental and racial. So it's like the combination of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and anti-racism all in one. And they just they had this big ceremony about it recently, I think last week. So that's my favorite right now.
Yes, that's a great one. I'm so glad you brought that up. What is your favorite flora or fauna?
So this changes a lot. And right now it's sunflowers, because there are these gorgeous sunflowers that are growing at the community garden. And I never realized that I like sunflowers so much, but I may have to take a picture and send it to Laurel and Jessa today, because we go to the community garden this afternoon, and send it to y'all to post with this, because they're amazing.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that.
And you might like sunflowers right now because it's Leo season, and sunflowers and the sun and Leo, they're all together. So they're very empowering at the moment.
Yes. I love the Leos and the power and the grandiose, what they bring.
All right. And then finish this sentence. Wouldn't it be cool if?
There was no racism or environmental injustice in the world.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for staying with us a little extra time today. We really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released, and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.